I would say it like this, like, let's start out like this. So the interesting thing for me, I'll even say in this discussion, like, if I notice no one gives any points to Z, well, I'll try and like do the devil's advocate and I'll think up some angle myself. Like, what I would say is this, T, is when you look at s1mple and you watch him, right? Do you actually have a hard time? Do you think you have a grasp? Obviously, the problem is I always discuss like the kills. I think they're like the fireworks. You know, you can watch them. You can only watch the game that way if you want. You can go, wow, bloody wow. And obviously, he has probably the best style for that. But it does mean, and it's kind of like what he'd alluded to before earlier in s1mple's career, it does mean sometimes it's hard to actually remember, like, well, how was he positioning in that round? And like, what do you think he actually was thinking, like, tactically? Or what you just think to yourself, he's just shooting everyone in the head? What do you actually think of s1mple, like the player outside of his aim and his skills?
s1mple is one of those guys where a lot of the time we remember the flashy stuff, the 1,000 repeats on the same angle, hitting every single flick, the ridiculous, like, I remember one of his kills, he just bunny hopped into an angle and just hit a flick, and I was like, there's no analysis for that, it's just he did it. But when you watch him play, and he's got like this textbook side of him that comes out a lot, where he's doing this shoot, reposition, textbook stuff, you see the device do it, you see every AWPer do it, just he starts about 50 meters further forward, and then does the process of shooting, repositioning, playing off of, he's been flashed off. He's not going to repeat it immediately. He's going to take his time, take the support from his teammates. He does things that are textbook correct. It's just that everything that you remember after the best of 3 series where he's dropped 98 kills is, the ace, the one taps, the ridiculous flicks. But the stuff that gets missed is his movement from angle to angle, his ability to reposition seemingly faster than everyone else, even though we're all playing the same game. He still repositions faster, he gets into those good angles, and he has favorable fights.
Sure. What do you think?
I mean, I agree with him. And like what he said about textbook, I think it just shows like the mastery of his fundamentals. And like the fact that like he's able, like if you watch him play, like he considers like so many micro scenarios, and like even if like it doesn't come to pass, you still see like his crosshair placement is considering something. He's ready for like if a situation should arise, he's ready for it. And to be able to do that in high stress, like I've recently, the last couple of years, I've been learning martial arts, and then there's one thing to do something at a low drill speed, and there's another thing when you add in intensity, stress, all those other factors, like you really descend to your lowest level of training. That's what my teachers have always said, and it just shows like when you see s1mple play, it shows like his mastery of fundamentals are really like to an extent that like we haven't really seen anyone else in Counter-Strike like reach that level.
Sure. I actually saw a recent video. It was one of those rivalry ones where they ask the pros. Usually they're garbage because like the pros just say some stupid shit or the question's not interesting. But I actually saw on this one that they had an interesting, because it was about, like, I think the question was like, why is s1mple so good, or why is he the GOAT or something? So actually that's a bit way better question than is he, or, who do you think is the GOAT? And the interesting thing I found, that unsurprisingly, because he's an interesting guy, Carrigan said, I think it was Carrigan, is he actually said, and think about what praise this is coming from an in-game leader, he basically said something like, sometimes when you watch the demo back, what s1mple does doesn't make sense, and you'll think to yourself like, all right, well, he's like messed up here, or this is like a bad play or something, and then you realize after you see what happens though, that like basically you're the one that's like catching up, like you're the other one like, oh shit, that, yeah, you can do that as well. I always think the part that people don't factor in, because I'll be real, there have been a lot of really brilliant CSGO pros with skill wise that basically either were just playing off skill. I thought people like Config did this in their careers sometimes, and they could just do it because they had the best aim, or they were someone like ochs where it's like he's doing brilliant shit, but like if you paused the game and said, well, why are you doing that, he couldn't explain it to you, mate. It's intuitive, it just comes from, he is like a poet in some sense, it just comes from him, and that's one of the reasons, by the way, why he goes on these crazy ups and downs of his form, because when it's gone, it's gone. It's like being a painter or something, you just can't do it that day. Whereas the difference is with s1mple, first of all, he can explain it all. I'm not joking, I've had these convos with him, and it's exactly what Carrigan said there. I actually think his skill was almost like a magician's sleight of hand that distracted us all. We all thought like, right, well, if he's that skilled, there's no way he can know all about the game, etc. And on some level, you wouldn't initially, right? Because if you're so skilled that you can put yourself in any position and get out of it, it's going to be hard to learn things like positioning, what is the correct play, because you're just going to think, right, I had to hit that extra headshot and I could have done it. But what you find out over time is, if you follow s1mple's game, is basically because of his absurdly high skill level and the fact that if you look at how he seems to play, especially the last few years, it almost seems like he gets to be his own mini IGL. Like, I don't really believe people tell him where to go or tell how he wants to. It seems like he gets to have a lot of say in what he does. I think, no joke, he sort of designed his own philosophy of Counter-Strike, and that basically what he's doing, it's not that it's right or wrong, it's It's like you have to tune into his frequency and see how he's seeing the game. And when you see that, though, you'll realise that even some of the ridiculous shots he's going for listen, he has the skill to hit ridiculous shots, but it's almost like it allows him to be, in my opinion, the most decisive player I've ever seen. Like, if you ever see him in those crazy, like, 1v3s where he's no-scoping people, look, we all get distracted by the no-scope, but let's be real, if you've watched s1mple's career, that's not even like apparently a random shot for him. He just lands them, doesn't he? So it's more like because he just has the ability to get a kill no one else can get. He can go for a play and conceive of a play no one else can get. That's why I actually use the word, which I don't think you should throw on liberally. He is genius in some sense, you know. Like, I don't claim to understand everything he's doing myself. Sometimes it takes me a while to be like, what really was even the play here?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, you just talk about that sort of conceptualizing him. So, you know, he sees what he's going to do ahead of time. I think that part of it factors in when he does it faster than everyone else can. He calculates the position faster than everyone else can. That's where the genius comparison, you kind of feel like it's chess almost. You know, the highest level grandmasters, they always calculate. They do the scenarios. They draw them up in their heads faster than any non-extreme, like, freak case can. And he's basically that, but with a Counter-Strike player. He just figures out the scenario, figures out the play he can make, and then goes out and does it.
Yeah. I read a book called Thinking Fast and Slowly by Daniel Kahneman, and they talk about chess grandmasters, and they talk about how basically they've practiced so much about certain strategies that the neural pathways activate. It's a lower activation cost, and it comes to them quicker. So I think like some of that is with s1mple too. Like he just has so much experience, and like it's a testament to his hard work and his like fortitude, I guess. But in another sense, like what I want to bring up is I think like some of it with s1mple too, like what we see of him today is like, you know how like there's a saying that heat forges steel or tempers steel or something.
Yes.
Essentially, like I think it's that. Like he was in like terrible circumstances for most of his career. If you look at team wise, like even when he first joined Na'Vi, on paper, like it was supposed to be like a very skill stack lineup. You had Seized, who was a phenomenal player at the time. Guardian was supposed to be coming off a wrist injury, but he was still renowned across the world. But it ended up being him still dragging like carcasses to the finish line. So I think some of that has just gotten him to this point. So like I don't think you'll see other superstars like put those long yards in and get to this point. Like I think he's just a one of one.
Yeah, I mean, listen, obviously the journey you take is like unique to you in that sense. I also thought it was the same for Nico. Like for me, if you look, because he was on such bad teams, like regional teams and that shit mouse spots, no wonder he had to be perfect on every fucking entry. He had to be perfect on every angle. Crosshair has to be exactly perfect. So if he doesn't, he'll just be dead. You'll never hear from you'd have never heard of Nico, basically. I got a few points I was thinking of while you were talking. The chess analogy, right? I'll actually say I've even seen this in play. Because you know, nowadays, as mad as it sounds, like chess is almost becoming like esports where they stream and the fucking grandmasters, they do it like they were playing like high-level League of Legends or something. You know, they're just like, right, I'm going to play this other guy that's 1800 or whatever the fuck. And when they play, right, they can actually sometimes, basically on almost like Smurf accounts, the joke is people like Magnus Carlsen, Smurf, like they play like fucking accounts that you don't know it's them. And so I remember watching a game, it was only like, you know, like a 15-minute speed chess game or something, where this guy who's like a really high-level streamer and is actually like very highly ranked among people who publicly show their game, was just playing against, he didn't know Magnus Carlsen, who's like the great world champion and one of the best players ever. He was playing against his Smurf account. And basically, it's exactly what I said earlier. This guy who's the Grandmaster keeps going like, nah, it's a bit of an unusual play. It doesn't really make sense, does it? Like, I don't know what this guy's doing. And then the joke is, you know, like 1 minute later, he's lost the game. And then later he finds out it's Magnus Carlsen. It's like, oh shit, it's actually me who doesn't know what the fuck I'm talking about. Like, but it just shows how you yourself will think with your model. Like, oh, that doesn't make sense. That's wrong. And then you said it earlier about the whole martial arts thing. That was the thing I found really fascinating when I actually did a bit of Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu back in the day, because I just wanted to understand MMA, basically. I was a big fan of like UFC and Pride, etc. And the thing that is insane is people don't get it. Like there's no way, it's impossible that they are consciously thinking of the Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, like chains and transitions that they do. They have just learned to react to an opening, basically. Like there was a fight recently where Mighty Mouse, who's obviously one of a really brilliant lightweight, I'd say lighter weight fight. He's not actually lightweight class, but you know what I mean? Like when this guy was fighting, he did one of those ones where like, as he was like trying to suplex a guy into the ground, he instantly transitioned to like a fucking leg lock or something mental, mate. Like, and if you see the way they do this, essentially you're doing that move while you're doing another move, while like you're reacting to whatever that guy, you aren't thinking that. No one's consciously thinking that. Like you have to have drilled that so much. It's almost like that is your body's reaction to being in that scenario. That's why there's that element, if you notice, with anything creative, where people get super super woo-woo and spooky with it, where it's like musicians always think they're being contacted by the muse or like something like spirit took over me or something. Because on some level, you have to sort of like just give up to some sort of, you could say like subconscious impulse or something that's just drilled into you, something innate in some sense. What do you think on this?
Yeah, well, that's...
Oh, go ahead.
Okay.
No, go ahead, someone.
I'll take it. I mean, it's... The idea that practice makes perfect is essentially that, in the most basic of forms. And you watch something that was always impressive about s1mple early on, and then it continued into his Na'Vi days. He never slacked. It's like slacked off on his practice. He was consistently putting in the highest hours of any player on his teams or otherwise, essentially. And people are like, well, you know, he's made it. Most players don't practice this hard. But no, he kept on grinding. Even when he streams, you know, he's trying, he's practicing, essentially, in his mind. And it's this sort of devotion that, creates that automated response almost, that sort of instinctive, some people would call it just, an instinct, but it's realistically, it's a hard work just forged into his mind that when this happens instinctively, everything else just falls into place. And I think the Demetrius Johnson flying armbar, or I thought it was an armbar.
It could have been armbar, yeah, true.
It's a brilliant example of that, of just the way it felt to him in the air. It just transitioned almost automatically.
Yes.
And that's essentially what you're watching when you're watching s1mple.
Yeah, and one thing I always found fascinating about s1mple was in a video you made, Thorin, about talking about his practice, where you said you had conversations with him and that he would drill essentially like very niche aspects, like very granular details, and he would put in maybe I don't know about the time, but like he would put in work.
No, he would drill it,
those aspects. And like 100%, even in martial arts, like that's the same thing. Like you have to consider very granular details, and it's clear, like watching s1mple, like that's exactly what he's done. Like he's probably like put in hours and hours of thinking about those details and working, polishing those details at a very slow pace, and then picked up the intensity and probably and now like what you see is the finished product on the server, which is just masterpiece.
I mean, the example I know I gave in one video was like doing jumping no scopes.
Mm-hmm.
Like the reason why he can hit so many that other people can't is because other people's logic. Like if I asked Guardian, who by the way isn't a notorious practicer, he would go like, well, how often do I go for a jumping no scope? Like, you know, if it happens, it happens. I'm not going to. s1mple's logic was I would actually literally go in the server and I would just repeatedly do the jumping no scope over and over and over again in like CSDM or I guess bots or something. And I will literally try again to intuitively just train my like timing of when to do the shot, what apex. I'm not doing it all consciously, you know, like I'm just trying to train it so that again, I just do it basically. And so I always thought that was incredible because obviously again, like if you ever watch any of the great martial arts fighters and stuff, like that's just in their game. I think that's also unfortunately why, similar to Shocks, when they basically like go downhill a bit, they always think they can win every fight still, they can still come back and all that. Like they have this mad belief that doesn't exist anymore, but it's like unfortunately your brain might be able to do it, mate, but your body doesn't respond anymore. Like you're just not that guy. You're 10 years older or you've had all the damage done. The other thing I was going to say when you said the thing about the neural pathways lighting up, basically that's always been the thing where when people tell me like you have an amazing memory, it's like, look, in real life I had like a good memory. Like, you know, if you'd asked me like a TV show I liked or something, I could probably remember a decent amount of stuff. But I don't have like, I've never thought I had like a photographic memory. Like I can't remember every detail of it. I don't just see an image and just read it off or like some shit in a movie. But I will say what people don't get about the history aspect is if you watch a lot of my videos, you'll notice I often bring up the same references and the points and people know. And basically what I've done is if you think of the idea that when you first establish the neural pathway, it's just loosely connected and it can, you know, can disconnect if you don't use it. It's like I've made a whole bunch of fucking autobans in my brain basically. Like if I talk about a team, I then think of the performances of the players and the tournaments that they were at and who their rival was and what they go that. And basically I've just built out the network and I've basically tried to sort of like re-establish it over and over and over again. It's why basically I do notice if I go really far back or I never really did content about something, that's where I'll have more of a memory. Like some people, like you'll be a bit cloudy, you know. But obviously if I talk about any of the CSGO stuff where I basically lived it, like I was at the event or I knew the player or I watched it afterwards or I watched the demo or I did a video, like there's about 11 ways I could remember that piece of information, you know. I don't have to just remember like one time I watched it or something. So I think a lot of people actually take for granted that they don't actually know how good their memory is in that scenario. They haven't tried it. They basically haven't tried building it up. They just think, which you'll notice, by the way, is actually a key part of any discussion about practice. Most people actually do think of themselves in kind of a static fashion. They think, I'm good at this, or like, I'm this good at this. Because the thing I always thought was crazy, like I gave the analogy about s1mple and Guardian, is the amount of players I've met who, when they're really good, think things like, well, I don't have to practice much because I'm already the best on my team. And it's like, bro, did you hear the part where I said the best player ever practices the hardest to this day? Like, it's the opposite way. That's why he's the greatest ever. Like, the whole point is you're just hoping it happens. He basically forced it to happen almost.
Yeah, and as a tangential point, like to build on that, like one thing I've always found ridiculous, like that I think I've even recently heard you say this, is that like pros that like don't watch demos, which to me just baffles my mind, because I feel like that's like such an important aspect of the game that you just have to build upon. That watching demos is building, like those chess masters, how they're constantly reviewing games and building those strategies, wanting to recall that quicker. Like, how are you gonna instantly read rotations and stuff like that without watching demos? And like, after all, like in football, CSGO is also a game of inches. Like, one round can make or break like a playoffs, anything. So to not be willing to drill those aspects to get those advantages like baffles my mind.
Oh, it's nuts. Like the amount of them that basically don't know, like because they're also doing stupid things that they're thinking, but I scrim against him, so I kind of do know how he plays. And it's like, bro, you could literally look at like how he positions on like in an area or how he backs. There's like a million things you could take, but some of them don't get it. Unfortunately, that's the area where they're like the IGLs and the coaches all do that, but some of the pros are still like some of the star players. You'd be shocked at the ones that are just like demos. What are you, some sort of nerd? Like those guys.
That actually brings up something interesting. I had a conversation in a pub recently with someone who was talking about reaching a certain cap in his game, like in his personal game, and then talked about how people would always criticize him for his game sense. And he didn't understand what that meant. And I just talked to him, I was like, have you ever watched like any pro develop over any amount of time and then put some actual thought into why they changed the way they play? And this came up to me because I was watching some demos for a Danish player. And he, 3 months ago, playing Nuke, playing Ramp, for example, he would never make the right play. He would never push at the right time. Like, when there was a lobby crunch or when there was a flanking opportunity, he would never make the right play. 3 months later, he's doing it. And you just think it's pretty simple. He watched the demos, he studied, because I know this guy is quite into his practice, into his research, and then instinctively got better at making the read off of what his opponents did. And that's the sort of thing where demos should be a part of your practice schedule. It should be a part of what you do. Looking at yourself, especially, I think, to see what it is you did and why it went wrong. But then also looking at opponents, looking who you're going to play, and even just looking at people you're never going to play again in the past, because they can all teach you something.
Yes. By the way, that is a great point as well, but there's another area. Listen, I'm talking about just getting them to bloody watch the opponent. I could never convince most of these guys to ever watch a demo themselves. They'll even say the stupidest, ignorant shit like, I can sort of remember what I did wrong in the game and I won't do it again. It's like, holy fuck, dude, you actually are at like an amateur level almost. That's why I say it a bit dismissively. Some of them are sort of just like, they're not, listen, a lot of plebs listening, I'm probably going to underestimate how bad they are because I've played with a lot of good players in my career. I would just say, a lot of people who are semi-pro, if you just had like 3 times better aim, you could actually hang with some of these guys. Like, they're not the geniuses that they might appear, in the pro scene itself. So yeah, so some of that is definitely a bit overrated, and they definitely don't get the idea. Like, I think it's mega valuable that you rewatch your own demo, you try and watch it with different eyes, and you try and actually ask the hard questions, and you don't think some bullshit like, it's just a bit off with that aim. You're like, why was I even in that position in the first place? What could I have done? Could I have helped a teammate over here? Was I actually mispositioned? So a lot of them do think stuff like, but if I'd hit the head, normally I hit that deagle headshot. It's like, again, you sound like you're a matchmaking guy on Reddit telling a story about how you lost the round, mate,
Mm-hmm.
What do you think, Encash?
Sorry, I lost my train of thought. I had a point, so
try rewinding it.
Yeah, I mean, I guess to build upon it, what I wanted to say was I feel like people sometimes put themselves into a box in terms of improvement, and they say like, I am built for this aspect, but I won't be able to improve in this other aspect.
Right.
But I feel like sometimes that's like more of a fallacy in the way our brains think, and that we like tend to underestimate how much like you can actually improve in certain aspects if you are willing to put the time in. So I feel like some of those pros might be thinking that like I'm like more of like a turn my brain off, like I'm a robot player, let the robot, like all the aim training I've done, let that take over and let that go through. But like I feel like they don't consider, like, if you turn into a more well-rounded player, perhaps like by you watching more demos, that allows you, like you said, to put, instead of having to rely on hitting that deagle headshot that one time, maybe you can position better, maybe you can think about better ways to like take those fights, set yourself up to have better opportunities. So I feel like it's not just like those players. I feel like that's just a way, like, and people think that they tend to put themselves into boxes and not really work on their weaknesses and rather just focus on their strengths.
Sure. How about we do this then? I guess we're not really doing s1mple versus Z. We're just doing s1mple, and then let's talk about Z-Move. So it's whatever. It's a whatever. People can figure out themselves by what we're talking about if they like them better or not. Want to see more cool, funny, interesting clips based on topics from my content? Well, subscribe to this channel then, or, be a pleb and don't.